All right. So this is where we left off. The last thing that we were looking at in the taxes, voting, and bread. You could say that it's Bread Part II. Was the peasants being the last social class to kind of come into this thing. And that's where the storming of the Bastille, stuff that's happening in urban Paris, is spreading out into the countryside. And the peasants are kind of letting their feet do the talking, whereas the tennis court is letting their mouths do the talking. But remember, that's where the revolution is really carried out. The lower classes are putting the revolution into action rather than just putting it on paper. All right, and that's what's kind of important now. So now we've got this basically chaos all over France. All right, and so what they describe, at least in your reading, as far as the Great Fear is concerned, where's the quote in here about it? So the Great Fear saw the burning of chateaux, the destruction of records and documents, and the refusal to pay feudal dues. The peasants were determined to take possession of food supplies and land that they considered rightfully theirs. They were reclaiming rights and property they had lost through the aristocratic resurgence of the last quarter century, as well as venting their general anger against the injustices of rural life. Remember, that's their cahier de doléances. All right, but they're not sending a lot of representatives, like I said, when the Estates General was meeting. All right, their agitation is already there. It's been there. It's been brewing for decades. And now the action that's taking place in Paris is now spilling out. Okay, so what you have is uprisings in the city, uprisings in the countryside called the Great Fear. And now the tennis court oath, which is, at least at the beginning we thought was going to be threatened, is now in, because the king had to redirect all of the concerns about the troops. Then he lost control of the troops because the troops ended up blending with the protesters in Paris. And now the tennis court people are more or less running the country. And they've taken on that agency called the National Assembly. They're no longer using the words Estates General. They saw it as archaic. And now they're going to try to calm the frontiers here. And the move that they make is just referred to in history as the Night of August the 4th. Okay, and that's this document. It's a declaration, but it's the one where we've now taken the Enlightenment and ideas about how, there's a natural condition for humankind and we're all equal before the law, and now it's making that happen. And we would say that this is the day that feudalism dies. Okay, is this night in this declaration. And you can look at the document itself, but at the very beginning, what it says is, the National Assembly completely abolishes the feudal regime. That's a pretty declarative statement, right? It decrees that among the rights and dues, all those originating in real or personal serfdom, personal servitude, and those which represent them are abolished without indemnification. All others are declared redeemable, and that the price and mode of redemption shall be fixed. And then they get into some weird stuff, like it says the exclusive right to maintain pigeon houses and dovecotes is abolished. It's just basically talking about monopolies that the nobles had in the manor, and now those things are gone. All right, the exclusive right to hunt and maintain unenclosed warrens is abolished. That's referring kind of to the Enclosure Acts. Manorial courts are suppressed without indemnification, meaning nobles that more or less able to dispense justice how they saw fit. Tithes of every description and dues which have been substituted for them are abolished. And they were talking about how they can make, you can do charity and those type of things, but you can't mandate it. And that's kind of how they saw it and the church's function. The sale of judicial and municipal offices. All right. And then the last one is the one that really kind of sticks, and it says all citizens without distinction of birth are eligible to any office or dignity, whether ecclesiastical, civil, or military. That's the statement as far as the aristocratic age is over, the feudal age is over. We are now at least recognizing that all people are equal before the law and have equality of opportunity. Okay, and we'll get into the stuff that it doesn't mean as we move through it. Okay, so let's jump into the notes then and kind of look at this phase as we go through it. Okay, so I said this phase is sometimes referred to as the National Assembly phase, sometimes it's referred to as the moderate phase, sometimes it's referred to as the bourgeois phase. But remember that the nobility, when they finally got that meeting of the Estates General, their conclusion was supposed to be, we want to author a glorious revolution. Okay? In substance, in whatever. All right? Now we have gotten to a place where the bourgeoisie has captured at least the ruling portion of, or the direction of the revolution, and they want to carry out an American revolution that is based on middle class ideals, all right, things that the bourgeoisie would care about. Okay? And that's what we're looking at. And the very first thing that come out of their throats was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which I referred to as a riff off of John Locke. Because that's what it was. All right? John Locke talks about life, liberty, and property. Jefferson talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They talk about liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. All right? And then it's basically the ideals. It has not been codified into a constitution. The end point of this National Assembly phase is what's called the Constitution of 1791. All right? That's to create a constitutional monarchy which has attributes that we would regard as bourgeois attributes. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom from arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. You can literally read the Bill of Rights, and that's what's being outlined here. Okay? Why mention property? Who has it, who doesn't?
The nobles have property and the peasants don't.
The middle class also has property. Okay, they are property owners. They own businesses. They have private holdings. But a lot of the urban workers do not. And at least at that point, because of the way that land had been redistributed out in the countryside, a lot of the peasants do not. Okay, they're rural laborers or something to that effect. So when you start talking about property and you're talking about the primacy of property, that's going to be one of the things that's going to stick out right away. All right? You're trying to create a classical liberal document and create a classical liberal direction in a country that is in a state of emergency. All right? That's the part that we haven't gotten to yet. We understand what the bourgeoisie cares about and what they're about. Laissez-faire economics, the primacy or the sacredness of private property, individual liberties, equality of opportunity, and legal equality. Those are all what we call classical liberal ideals. It doesn't mean sexual equality. We'll talk about that. Even though there was a hope among some of the leading female authors and activists that there was going to be at least a place for women as citizens. But we'll see that that gets disconnected pretty fast. The Rousseau wing of the Enlightenment ends up winning that argument instead of the Wollstonecraft wing. And that's unfortunate. Okay? But it doesn't mean that there weren't women that were all over this revolution. All right? In thought and in practice. And we'll get to that in just a second. In fact, we're going to get to it really quick here. All right? I want you to keep this in mind, though, that we are dealing with a situation where we know what the middle class care about, but we also know that the sans-culottes were not out in the streets of Paris about arbitrary ideas like liberty and freedom of this and freedom of that. They wanted bread, and they wanted jobs. And those are real, tangible, real life-altering things. All right? But if you think about it, does that not violate laissez-faire economics? If you were to regulate the price of bread, if you were to create jobs instead of letting the market dictate it, if you were seizing property in order to take grain from one, the producer, and give it to B, the consumer, that's going to violate a lot of those market economics-oriented things. All right? And so there's going to be a disconnect right away. The middle class want laissez-faire. The people... The majority of the poor people, they want fair. They want the government involved that's going to create some things that can feed them and give them some life. And there's where the disconnect's going to be. Because we know that the bourgeoisie is authoring this phase of the revolution, but the sans-culottes and the peasants may not feel like they're part of this revolution. And that's really where the sticking point is here. Nonetheless, the lower classes continue to put in work, all right, on the revolution. We know that they did it in the storming of the Bastille. We know that they did it in the Great Fear. And then there was this break while they did this Night of August the 4th legislation, while they did the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen legislation. But now they're kind of waiting around. It's like these people that were poor and that were dealing with the high bread prices and were starving finally said, who's helping us? And a lot of the women actually were the ones that said, we're going to go help ourselves. And the only thing that we know is, at least in their mind, the king is still the one in charge. And they said, we're going to march to Versailles and we're going to get us some bread. And we're pretty upset about the fact that we don't have bread yet. This is that Marie Antoinette moment. Okay? It's called the Women's Bread March. It is also referred to by the dates that it occurs, October 5th and 6th of 1789. And again, the sans-culotte is leading to a new movement, all right, in this revolution. Okay? Women were, and we're talking about, lower class women, some foul-mouthed women that wanted to do some violence. All right? They were carrying sticks and pikes and anything they could get their hands on. They're marching from Paris to Versailles, and they want Marie Antoinette's head. Because they see her as the symbol of, aristocratic excess or monarchical excess. And the fact that the royal family is so buffered from the poor people that surround that, estate. You always, I have a visual of it, and it's, you're kind of, you see, Louis and Marie Antoinette, and they're walking through the great gardens of Versailles. And then you see, this barbed wire fence on the perimeter. And there's all these, poor children that are feed me, feed me. And it's look, honey, poor people. And that's the part where what are they saying? I think they're saying they're starving. And that's the, let them eat cake kind of thing. Because it's that pomposity. It's doesn't everyone have, large, coolers full of champagne? And doesn't everyone have pheasant? It's no. Really, they don't. The majority of the people are starving. You just don't understand that. And now there's some foul-mouthed women that want to make Marie Antoinette understand that. All right. So their intent was, we're going to take her. I mean, one of them even said, we're going to fry her liver. And it's just okay, easy. And Marquis de Lafayette is the one that actually intercepts the women's march and says, hey, we're not going to be frying anybody's anything. All right, everybody just needs to chill. Because if you murder the royal family, guess who's involved? The Austrians for sure, right? Because Marie Antoinette is a Habsburg. She is, Maria Theresa's one of her 12 kids. All right. And so the Austrian emperor, Marie Antoinette's brother, might be a little bent out of shape if little sis gets beheaded right now. All right. But that's, at least in Marquis de Lafayette's mind, there is some logistics to all of this. And if we're not ready, we can lose whatever gains we've made in this revolution. And so there is a concern about that. So he's you all need to relax. There is this fear, though, that is now generated, especially among the lower class, that we can't get a read on whether the monarchy is with us or against us. And that is yet to be seen on whether the king and the queen are really down for the revolution or whether they're not. Okay? And it's almost because there was no timeliness on them dealing with the bread issue, all right, the women of Paris decided we'll march on Versailles, we'll deal with it ourselves. But then the other thing is, because there was even the threat of violence, now there's a concern that the king and the queen might flee. There's always going to be this fear of a counter-revolution. And even during the early stages of this revolution, there were monarchs, or there were nobility that left. They're called émigrés. Okay? These are, high-ranking aristocrats and others that, while, the things that were going down in the storming of the Bastille, or the Great Fear when they're burning people's chateaus down, they got nervous and they got out of Dodge. And they're probably in Austria or Prussia calculating their next move. which means those emigres are like a ready-made counter-revolutionary force that is just waiting for the king or the queen to give their like nod of approval. And that's what the revolutionaries are always going to be dealing with as they're going through this. Okay? So that's a concern. And to alleviate that concern, they took the royal family out of Versailles and marched them back to Paris, where they could keep an eye on them. So now they shack up in what's called Tuileries Palace. It's in Paris, but it's kind of like if you guys had a plan that you were going to leave, now that plan's a little bit foiled. All right? And that, like anesthetized, existence that you have in Versailles, that's gone now. All right, so you're going to be monitored, and if you're not down with the revolution, it's going to be pretty quick and pretty obvious to us. All right, so the king is, again, I feel like the king, and there's even like political cartoons that it'll look like Marie Antoinette is like carrying King Louis with her, like he's a child. Like you were like, like a kid would throw a tantrum in the middle of the mall, and the mom would like grab come on, we're going, And they would always like kind of paint Louis as he was this child that was being urged on by Marie Antoinette to do the wrong things. She seems to be the source of blame, at least early on. Okay. Wanted to talk a little bit about these boneheaded moderate plays. And there's going to be a couple of them that happened during this period. And I told you the really big issue at play here is whether the revolution is benefiting each of the social classes. We know that the night of August the 4th, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the intent of the bourgeoisie is to author out like the aristocratic thing. Okay? Any distinctions based on birth no longer matter. But then they immediately start to take over the dominant role and say, all right, well, we've eliminated birth as a distinction between the haves and the have-nots. Let's use property. Okay? And now property ownership takes its place where birth used to exist as the thing that separated society out. And the bourgeoisie, since they have property, they now have kind of like, they're starting to deal with their own interests. All right, at the expense of the people that don't have property. All right, in terms of if we do have a constitution, and if we do decide that we're going to allow representatives to take their seats in the assembly hall, we are going to make a distinction that says that certain amounts of property qualifications exist before you can take one of those seats, or before you can vote for the representatives that might take those seats. So you've already segmented out a good portion of the population that would be disqualified because they don't have enough property. And the sans-culottes and the peasants, remember, they've got more primal concerns right now, like eating. But later, they're probably going to start looking at some of the institutional structures, and they're going to say, the reason why we're not eating is because of these structures. And that's where they start to get wise, and they become more active politically. And then they can't be ignored. All right, but we're not there yet. Okay? The first thing that happens is in June, and this is like as they're starting to kind of get things ironed out, there's a couple of things that they do that make it clear that the middle class is now divided against the working class. The first one is called the Chapelier Law. And this is in June of 1791. And what the Chapelier Law did was it forbid the organization of workers into, collectives. It's basically what we're concerned about the possibility that they might unionize or they might strike. So they've declared it unlawful to do so. Because they're looking and they're seeing workers, and if the workers aggregate, all right, and eventually start to rebel against the decisions made by the middle class is going to lose. Because there's a hell of a lot more workers than there is of them. All right, so they're trying to get out in front of it. But you can start to see that breach exists. The second one, that is directly aimed at the working class. The second one isn't really aimed at anyone. It just kind of bent everybody out of shape. All right? And it has to do with handling their financial business. Because, remember why the French Revolution happened in the first place? Why? The French government was broke. So they're trying to figure out, I mean, in A, they definitely know that now that there's equitability of taxation amongst all the people, that they ought to be able to balance their books. All right, but they're not quite there yet. All right, so the other way that they thought that they could get some revenue to start getting them into balance was to confiscate church property. And church property was abundant. Okay, and so the idea was we were going to confiscate church lands, and then we're going to sell those lands off, and then we're going to create a paper currency that we can use as an exchange for that sell-off, and it's called assignats. All right, so that's happening, and obviously we know that. How's the church going to respond to that? All their property just got eaten up, and it's being now sold off. Is the church, or those that support the church, are they going to be happy about this? No. All right. The second part of it is that they made the clergy swear a loyalty oath to the state. Okay? That's where the term juré means to swear. All right? And the clergy that did not swear this loyalty, remember, this is kind of like weird, but if you think about it, it's like looking at what Henry VIII was doing around the time of the 1530s, when they were confiscating the monastic property, and they were swearing, people had to swear loyalty oaths to him, and some people did and some people didn't. Now we've fast forwarded and we're kind of at that place now. All right? And the people don't really know how to respond to this. But if you're a priest that says, I'm not doing that, I'm not going to be a salaried official that works for the state, I am a clergyman, I am ordained, and my boss is in the Vatican. Now the problem is that if you have rural peasant worshipers, and you are one of those priests that said, not only am I not swearing that loyalty oath, but I'm leaving. I'm going to now join the emigres that are now congregating in places like Austria, or wherever. But they might even have a little exit, notification for their peasants and say, yeah, if you support these revolutionary people, you've basically lost your place in heaven. And you're like, come on, really? They still went for that in the 1790s? And you're like, yes, they did. Their loyalties are now torn. If the priest tells them that if they support this thing, they're not really supporting the church, that might put them in a crisis of conscience. And it was like a predominantly Catholic country, all right, that has now had its traditional Catholicism disrupted by a bourgeois move that is not only financial, but is also symbolic. All right, that's now going to call into question, where are the peasants' loyalties going to be here? Are they going to be with the revolution? Because at least in name, there's some benefits that they get from the revolution. They're no longer like the basis of taxation for the country. But what benefits have they really gotten from it so far? The peasantry. Any? All right. And then the other part is you're screwing with our church. Like that's the one constant thing we have in our lives. All right, for better or worse. And now you've absolutely disrupted that. So you figured out a way to agitate the workers through this Chapelier Law. You figured out a way to agitate the peasants, really almost unnecessarily, with this civil constitution of the clergy. You've got this army now of emigres that are made up of refractory priests and nobles that might have fled during the storming of the Bastille, or certainly the Great Fear. Okay? And we see these fissures that exist between the government that is directing things through the National Assembly and the sans-culottes and the peasants that don't feel like maybe they're a part of things yet. And you got this other thing where we don't know necessarily where the royal family falls on all of this. Okay? So that's the other concern that we have. All right? Not to mention the fact that politics is developing in France. All right, at a time when, remember, there's a lot of change, and it's happening very fast. Okay? So whether you're bourgeois, whether you're educated, or whatever the case may be, that there's these political clubs that are starting to form all over the place in France, in Paris, and France proper. Okay? So this is stuff that, and these are some names that you're going to need to know for later. Okay, you have this group called the Jacobins. All right, they're going to be really important later on. But they started out like as an up-and-coming political club. And they were looking at the revolution, and they're like, it hasn't gone far enough. All right, we still have a monarch. Why the hell do we have a monarch? All right, so they wanted to take it further. They wanted a republic. They wanted more radical change than what had already occurred. Yet another group called the Cordeliers. And that was going to be a group that would eventually merge with the Jacobins and would form this group called the Mountain. All right, these are young, kind of Pete Buttigieg type of folks, right? That in maybe a decade or so are going to be really prominent people. All right, but these are the youthful ones, the Alexandria Cortez types that are now getting really involved politically and want to know what the direction of the revolution is going to be. And they're kind of creating their own little gangs almost. All right, but eventually those gangs are going to run for office and they're going to become representatives. And then they have a political voice that can genuinely change the direction that the country's going. Okay, next thing. It's called the Flight of Varenne. June 20th, 1791. Okay, this is like our little comic interlude. Because Marie Antoinette and Louis the Pooh have decided that they're going to make an escape. All right? They were a little bit shocked out, from the Bread March. They're a little nervous about some of the, just some of the underlying things that seem to be happening during the assembly phase. A little nervous about the sans-culottes, a little nervous about what they're experiencing. All right? And remember, we don't really know where the political family or the royal family stands in terms of, do we support the revolution or do we not? And there are indications that Louis was down for some of the changes that were taking place. And now there's indications that he's not. And the indication was they're going to disguise themselves with a bunch of servants and they're going to make a run for the border. It's like, how the hell is the royal family going to escape? Marie Antoinette's going to have like 14 carriages lined up of her wardrobe. All right. That's not really incognito. And so eventually they get found trying to make it to Austria. And they get intercepted. And they bring them back. Do they kill them? They don't. Why?
Because they need them to be a martyr.
Yeah, and again, you still are dealing with this potential Austria thing, right? If you kill them, there's going to be an Austrian invasion. No doubt about it. All right? So they ended up making up some story to say, like, some brigands or whatever tried to kidnap the royal family, but thankfully we rescued them and brought them back to the palace in Paris. And then they looked at Louis and said, I saw what you were up to. And now they're like, we have just completed the Constitution, sign it. Louis is looking at Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette's looking at Louis and is like, we got to do this. All right. That was sort of his I'm going to York moment. He's had a couple, but this was a very definitive I'm going to York moment. And we all know what that means. All right. No? You don't remember that? Were you in the bathroom?
Maybe.
All right. No, what I was referring to was Charles I when he was dealing with the fact that Parliament was making sweeping changes and kept raising his hand and saying, I have to go to the bathroom. I have to go to the bathroom in York. And then he went to York and he raised an army that was going to invade the Parliament. And then the Civil War broke out. Okay? So the question is Louis and Marie Antoinette, are they down for the same thing? Because if they make it to the border and they make it to Austria, they now got the support of the Austrian monarchy or the empire or emperor. They got the support of the Austrian army, and they also have the support of all of those counter-revolutionaries that are waiting from them among the French emigres. And that's the concern. Okay? And that's always where it's going to be. Anyway, there's going to be like 5 constitutions in the next decade and a half here. This is the first of them. And it formally creates a limited monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. It's called the Constitution of 1791. All right? So separation of powers, they created to make sure that there was a judicial, a legislative, and executive branch. There is a monarchy. There was going to be a ministry. They were trying to make sure that there was a power sharing agreement that would exist between the different groups. All of that Bill of Rights stuff that we were looking at, that was in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, is now codified. It is now law. They've abolished noble titles, so everybody is considered citizen now. All right? They're going to have trial by jury. They've abolished torture. But then the other stuff is making sure that they've got lines in there about how important property ownership was and how protecting private property was an important feature of governance. And then they also wanted to make sure that they were dealing with market economics, which means they don't want to seize grain in order to feed the cities. They don't want to dictate the laws of supply and demand, because those are natural things. And that means that jobs and growth and all of that stuff happens organically. It doesn't happen by government manipulation.
So laissez-faire?
Laissez-faire, but remember, like I told you, sans-culotte and the peasantry, they needed fair. They needed somebody that was going to give them land. They needed somebody that was going to give them jobs. They needed somebody that was going to regulate bread prices. And they're not getting that. And eventually that's going to become a thing. Okay? The next section is called The Role of Women in the Revolution. And there is a really good section of reading on this in Kagan. And I've referred to a handful of figures here. We know about Mary Wollstonecraft. All right. And this is like right in her pocket of time where she's trying to author at least some recognition that women deserve equal rights. There's another figure that is specific to the French. Her name is Olympe de Gouges. And her work was called A Declaration of the Rights of Women, which was essentially to look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and say, why are women excluded from this? Why are we going with this Rousseau logic that men are built for practical or civil affairs and women are supposed to play motherhood and domestic roles? Why this separate spheres thing? Why can't everybody have natural rights? All right. So that question is going to be out there. All right. And there are women that actively want to participate in the revolution because they feel included in it. All right. Even if some of the people are pushing back against them, there's a hope that comes with, like, if we're going to have this transformative change politically, that we might be included in it. All right. So they formed this group called the Society for Revolutionary Republican Women. And there's a woman by the name of Pauline Léon who is even petitioning for women to be able to take up arms, to protect themselves, to protect the revolution. All right. There are women that are active in every part of the revolution. Now the question is, can we make them part of the documents? And so far there's been pushback on that. Okay. At least as far as the revolution has gone so far, there's also people on the outside that were looking at it. And remember when we did the enlightened absolutist stuff and we were looking at how the Enlightenment had kind of, divided out how they believed political change could occur. Edmund Burke was one of those people that was looking at the French Revolution and said, this is going to go bad. All right. That they are making sweeping changes. They are abolishing monarchy. They are getting rid of all of their institutional structures, and they're now being guided by these abstract principles. And he's like, eventually the people that don't have an experience in governance are not going to be able to carry this thing through. It's almost like prophecy that Edmund Burke is saying in 1790 that there's going to be violence and there's going to be chaos at the end of the French Revolution. Because the people that are directing it do not know what they're doing. Okay? And they're turning their back on the institutions that have shaped French society for not just decades, not centuries, like a couple of thousands of years. All right? Okay. Next thing. And this is, you could say it's inevitable. Okay? Austria is going to make a statement. And Prussia eventually also makes a statement. But Leopold of Austria, who is the brother of Marie Antoinette, issues this document that is supported by Prussia called the Declaration of Pillnitz. And this is August 27, 1791. And it's a bluff, kind of. All right, it's Austria with their army. It's Prussia with their army. It's knowing that a lot of the French officers, because officers could only be drawn from the aristocratic, ranks, they were all gone. All right, they were going to be part of this counter-revolutionary force. And Leopold just wanted to throw it out there because we know the flight of Varenne failed. We know that Louis was angled into making this, constitution. We know that it seems like the power that they have over the country is starting to slip. So Leopold throws it out and says, Austria and Prussia or other countries reserve the right to potentially intervene in French affairs, in order to protect the royal family, or, if there is anything that would require us to intervene. And they were trying to speak for Britain, but Britain wasn't going to go along with it because why? Navy, colonies, what's the third one? Commerce. If it affects trade, if it affects their naval dominance, if it affects their colonial dominance, they'll get involved. But a nitpicky regime change in France or the direction of the French Revolution, that's not impacting them yet. So they're not worried about it. So Austria and Prussia are not going to be able to do that alone. But it was a bluff. It was literally like I'm going to jump at you. What are you going to do? Expecting the French to blink. What did the French do in response? They declared war. They said, you want to take our revolution from us? Is that what you're saying? We're not intimidated. All right, so they declared war on them, and now you're at war with Austria and Prussia. They probably said, as long as the royal family is kind of in this limbo position, all right, we want to make sure that the revolution is protected. We expected inevitably that some of these countries that still have these archaic institutions like aristocracy, as long as that stuff is out there, and as long as our revolution is threatened, we're going to take any and all comers. All right, we believe in what we're trying to accomplish here. All right, and eventually that's what's going to happen, is that Austria, the Netherlands portion that is controlled by Austria, called the Austrian Netherlands, and Prussia are now at war with France. And that's kind of where we're going to stop. Is that cool for today? All right. Questions? Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, the active versus passive citizens, like basically the ones who took a role in the revolution versus those who just stood.
Well, no, it was more than that. I mean, because there was active citizens that they wouldn't claim to be active citizens. I told you that they were tethering all of that to property qualifications. That those that could participate in the political process that were defined as active citizens were really just those that had something to lose. And property would have been that thing that they had to lose. No, the real activists were the sans-culottes, but they're not included in the language. And that's another reason that they don't feel like they have any place yet. Okay? So everybody understand that this thing is really complicated. There's a lot of different layers to this that need to get worked out. Okay? Where's the king and the queen on this? Is this breach that is starting to exist between the middle class that are directing the revolution and the sans-culottes and peasants, is that breach ever going to be filled? What's the role of Austria and Prussia going to be? What's going to happen now that there's a war between these different groups? It's sort of like, stay tuned to Act 3 when we start to figure these things out.
So with the middle class have declared war on Austria?
They did.
They did. Okay.
Yeah. And guess who was the first to enthusiastically endorse this war?
Louis.
Louis. Why?
Because he likes war.
If they lost, then he would be an active.
Exactly. If they lose, which he believes is going to happen, then everything restores back to original position. But if he's enthusiastic about their declaration of war, it makes it seem like he's front and center on the revolution. It's like, wait a second, Louis, you're for the war, and your wife is the sister of the people that we declared war on. How's that going to work out? All right. And the very reason that we declared war is because of this Declaration of Pillnitz that was all about whether we're going to harm you or not harm you. All right. Well, eventually they're going to harm them, right? Both of them are going to lose their heads. It's just a matter of time. All right. Okay, so we'll pick up that story tomorrow. Like I said, if you guys are reading some of this Kagan stuff, you're just going to kind of read on. Where we are right now in this is, let's see. There's a section called A Second Revolution. And that's where we are right now in the reading. And we're going to carry that out through, tomorrow we'll talk about the execution. And then we're going to start talking about the Reign of Terror and some of the more radical elements of the revolution. All right? Good.